Or breakout room.
So all this month we have been gathering here and thinking about a theme. At the beginning of the month, I spoke about the grief of extinction of species. And when I was doing that, I knew that I would be preaching again about a much closer notion of extinction, the apocalypse. Just last week, Ron and the Palisade Virtuosi took us on a musical journey through the heart of global warming and the rapidly changing planet. And in between the two, our very own Reverend Sarah Lindsay spoke about this moment and the call to UUs to be a part of it, to shout it from the rooftops, as Reverend Sarah said. And in a follow-up letter in the Wednesday e-blast, which I sincerely hope that you find the time to read, Reverend Sarah said that this year she wants to focus on shouting our UU values, our faith, and our heritage from the rooftops. Us UUs have been practicing the principles and virtues which this world needs in this moment for a very long time. People should know that religion and religious values are not dominated by one type of Christianity. People should know that there is a religious life for atheists and that the questions of morality and cosmology, theology, and the blessed community is a human inheritance, and that this is not held by this or that narrow faction. Now, you will hear me say today the term cosmology or theology, and I say this inclusively. Cosmology refers to one's beliefs of the makeup of the entire universe and the cosmos, whereas theology refers to the same thing but assumes the presence of a God, whoever or whatever that is for that person. Now, you have probably heard mention, especially in these times, the curse, which is falsely attributed to ancient China. The curse says, "May you live in interesting times." I like better a quote, actually, from a Chinese author Feng Minglong, from around the 1600s, that says, "Better to be a dog in tranquil times than a human in chaotic ones." Either way, this alleged curse has been talked about, and talked about more since the pandemic. Talk of the apocalypse, of the end of times, has been prevalent too, but too often this has been, I think, misunderstood. So one of my favorite articles from the early pandemic was written by the theologians John Thetomenal and Catherine Keller, and it was entitled, "Is This the Apocalypse? We Hope So, and so should you." In the article, they explain that their hope is not the resentful glee of the end of the world, but the hope for building a new one. They say, "Contemporaries keep using the term apocalypse, but literalist biblical interpretation notwithstanding, the term does not mean what many think it means. Deriving from the Greek apocalypsis, the word means unveiling or revelation. Now, when the term is understood as unveiling, we can then ask the right questions. What does the pandemic unveil? What have we refused to see about ourselves and the precarious world that we've built? A world that now stands exposed and tottering in the harsh light of this unasked for revelation. If we permit this crisis to expose the fissures of our failing world, this pandemic will have served as properly apocalyptic. If instead, despite its devastating toll, we return to an obsolete and unsustainable world, nothing meaningful will have been revealed." So today, I invite us to reflect upon the apocalypsis, the revelation of our world, not only in light of the pandemic, but in light of the forces attacking our democracy, our right to bodily integrity, our fellow creatures, and perhaps, too, our entire civilization. I invite you to reflect beyond the revelation of the fissures and to think of what we as UUs have to do to create a better world beyond the fissure. I hope that we find this time to be an apocalypse, for if it's not, I fear we may continue to live with an obsolete cosmology and in an unsustainable world. So I invite us to ask ourselves what we must do to invite the blessings of the earth and sky.
Our reading today comes from Ursula K. Le Guin's translation of the Tao Te Ching. The Tao is an ancient book attributed to Lao Tzu. In this section, Lao discusses what may be the closest thing to a Taoist vision of heaven. Note that it is very much an earthly material plane. Chapter 80, Freedom. Let there be a little country without many people. Let them have tools that do the work of 10 or 100 and never use them. Let them be mindful of death and disinclined to long journeys. They'd have ships and carriages, but no place to go. They'd have armor and weapons, but no parades. Instead of writing, they might go back to using nodding cords. They'd enjoy eating, take pleasure in clothes, be happy with their houses, devoted to their customs. The next little country might be so close, the people could hear cocks crowing and dogs barking there, but they'd get old and die without ever having been there.
There's a science fiction novel by the Chinese novelist Kai-Shin Liu called The Three-Body Problem. In this book, an alien civilization has discovered Earth. That civilization is able to disrupt things on the Earth from great distances because of its superior understanding of physics. So its first task is to disrupt the world population from advancing in physics and chemistry, effectively neutralizing our ability to technologically advance to challenge the threat they pose. The alien planet is constitutionally less stable than the Earth and thus less desirable to sustain life. So the aliens set out to take over Earth. The only thing is that the alien civilization is 450 years away from reaching its destination. Thus, the inhabitants of Earth are forced to make a decision. Do we attempt to pour all of our resources into trying to overcome the technological shield placed by the aliens? Do we try to do something more clever and outwit the aliens? Or do we just leave it for the next generation to figure out? I mean, 450 years is a long time. 450 years ago, the French were fighting the wars of religion between the Catholics and the Protestants. Pennsylvania was not even a concept, and the internal combustion system was 300 years away from existence. Now, this is, or at least was, a seemingly good metaphor for the climate apocalypse facing the world. It's a huge problem, a complex problem, and its consequences seemed rather distant or almost hard to believe. I remember when I first heard about the climate apocalypse, the 2006 film An Inconvenient Truth. Now, see, I grew up in rural and suburban Colorado, so I was fairly familiar with people talking about the end of the world. There were those who were stockpiling guns and goods in preparation for the pending collapse of civilization. Or there were those who were the Christian apocalypticists, holding their breath that it was the second coming and that God's anger would rain down upon their enemies. I was used to the portrayals of the end of the world in popular media, and it was in that context that I viewed this film. And it was strange to hear someone talking about the danger not from the point of view of a religion I did not believe in, whether that be guns and individualism or Christian salvation. And it was strange to hear science and rationalism backing up the claims. But the movie failed to, and I know I'm not alone in this, judging by the actions of many of us since, the movie failed to move me toward meaningful action. And I think there are many reasons for this, but today I want to focus in on one of these, and it's one that I think is most vital. Now, this is a complicated topic, but I want to focus in on the roots of our spiritual lives. And I will say that regardless of our cosmology or our theology, we all have spiritual lives insofar as we think of spiritual life as meaning those underlying beliefs and experiences that we have which inform our decisions. And I want to talk broadly about two general approaches in our spiritual lives to history, the future, and civilization. The first I will call a providential view or a providential world. This is an underlying belief that the world is human-centered, that the world cares about our well-being, and in some iterations that ultimately we will be saved or reunited with God or being or love. In the providential worldview, everything is ultimately as it should be. The second worldview that I wish to speak of is what I will call, following the theologian William Connolly, it's what I will call tragic vision. Tragic vision places us in a precarious world, a world which is not centered on humans, a world which is not inherently good, a world that does not of necessity lead to salvation or wholeness. Tragic vision rejects human-centeredness, and it rejects providence. It is tragic in that way of a Greek tragedy. The gods are in their own fight, and we are here fending for ourselves. Now, I bring these two visions up because when we talk about the end of the world, and that is fundamentally what we are talking about when we're talking about climate change, when we talk about the end of the world, we are ultimately talking about the beginning of the world. And we are talking about our fundamental beliefs about meaning, meaning-making, and our role in it all. So as I had mentioned earlier, the word apocalypse is Greek, and it does not mean calamity. It means a revealing or unveiling. Thus, the book of the Christian Bible, the Apocalypse of John, is rightly translated as Revelation. That book, which gets a lot of airtime in modern imperial Christianity, describes the end of the Roman Empire. It describes not the end of our world, but the end of John's world. The end of the world as we know it, reveals, uncovers, exposes the fractures of the world that is ending. So in Revelation, it was primarily revealing the oppressive and monstrous nature of the Roman Empire. The climate apocalypse is the revelation of our time. How we view it, how we see it, what it reveals to us is the fracture and fragility of our world. The climate apocalypse and its revelations tell us what is ultimately meaningful to us and what matters to us. And I emphasize this point because as UUs, we do not have baked into our faith the end of the world. Some forms of Christianity center their religion on the end of it all, the second coming of Christ. Often, talk of the end is tainted with the priorities of a certain type of Christianity and its vision of justice. So, what does it mean to us UUs that this very well may be the end of the world as we know it? That 450 years of waiting for the aliens has shrunk for us, and perhaps we have 10 or 20 or 30 before the climate apocalypse really opens its maw. We're already experiencing some of it here and now. And often when we feel this, we are preoccupied with how can we stop it? How can we stop the climate apocalypse? But I do want to put that question to aside 1 minute. That is an important question to ask, and we have to ask ourselves at this point, prepare ourselves seriously that regardless what we do, whether we stop the worst of climate change, reverse it, or whether we succumb to the point of no return, no matter what, this is the end of the world as we know it. The things that would be required of us are so great that even if we win this fight against climate change, this world, with all of our expectations for a particular future, is over. So how do we meet this moment? What I have heard called the razor's edge of time. How do we meet this moment spiritually? The tools of providence and progress are not fit for this moment in time. The end of the world that tells us that the divine is coming down and gathering up the best believers is one that not only rings hollow, but is one that is fundamentally about resentment. It is exactly what our universalist forebears fought against. Selective salvation is an extension of the unequal justice of today enacted at a cosmic level. Universalism's belief in universal salvation means that salvation is not a means to meta justice, that job is left to us humans. So also the belief that the human history is one of progress toward greater justice and greater accomplishment ignores the very precarity of the world we live. I have had the same few months of the Supreme Court that you all have had. I've had the same 6 years that you all have had. I have mourned the sixth great extinction, as many of us have. Cosmologies that approach the apocalypse with eyes closed will be swallowed up in it. Resentment and despair threaten to surround us when we stare into this particular abyss. So, how do we build a theology that does not sink into resentment and despair, a cosmology that calls us to embrace our neighbors, fight the influence of empire, and love more completely? There is a quote from the Jewish theologian Elie Wiesel that I keep coming back to. Now, Wiesel lived through the Holocaust. And Wiesel reads the book of Job, and for those of us who don't remember, the book of Job goes like this. God makes a wager with another supernatural entity that Job will remain faithful, even if all of the providential things God has provided for him are stripped away. His family is killed, his property destroyed, his body infected and covered in maggots. And Job cries out to God, "Why is this happening?" And God appears in a tornado and essentially chastises Job, and then goes through a litany of God's accomplishments. It is a notoriously bad response to the question of why evil exists. But Wiesel, reading Job in the light of the apocalypse of the Holocaust, says, "Thanks to Job, we know that it is given to humans to transform divine injustice to human justice and compassion. It is given to us to transform divine injustice to human justice and compassion." This is tragic vision. It is an impatient vision. It is a prophetic vision. It is the vision of the oppressed. Tragic vision tells us that there is nothing at all that guarantees that justice will be the final result. Nothing at all that guarantees humanity will be saved, nothing at all that keeps evil away, except our actions, except our steadfast commitment to justice, to love, to grief. It is given to us to transform divine injustice or indifference to human justice and compassion. The providential worldview tells us that technology will save us, that history has been leading to this moment of climate apocalypse, but so too has our cleverness exceeded beyond any problem, or that God is driving this car. The tragic worldview tells us that we are living on the razor's edge of time and there is nothing guaranteed to save us. So many of our oppressed siblings know tragic vision. It's the vision that says we can't wait for history to slowly lead us to the promised land. The climate apocalypse reveals the thousands of apocalypses that have been happening every day. The immigrants traveling to our shores because their very earth can no longer churn forth its resources. This is part of that apocalypse. It's part of that apocalypse that is waiting for us. The vision of the collapse of civilization simply expands the enterprise that has been crushing so many already. The vision of human extinction is the reality of so many creatures on this planet today. From the apocalypse of the slaughterhouse where animals are bred in miserable conditions only to die, to the indigenous bird, last of its species, calling out for love at the end of time. Tragic vision is the vision of the oppressed, the revelation of the reviled, who at once remind us that we are not that much different from the refugee, not that far away from being that refugee ourselves, and that there is only us, myself, us, those around us, who can call for any type of justice. We don't have the luxury to wait for divine intervention. So what does that mean for us UUs? Well, I believe that we do two things best: grief and justice work. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, a UU memorial service is powerful. Our memorial services are not a motor to evangelize, nor are they a motor to perpetuate a providential worldview that assures everyone that this person is in God's loving hands now. Our memorial services do not rush from wounds to healing. Our memorial services focus on the individual. They reflect upon the meaning of their life, and we reflect upon the entire person in their beauty and in their struggles. The whole person, not what we want them to be, but who they were. Now, if you have ever been to a UU memorial service, you know what I mean. And at the end of the world as we know it, this practice of grief is vital. We have lost so much, and we are going to lose so much in the coming years. Grief ungrieved feeds resentment. We must grieve. We must grieve the loss of our animal kin. We must grieve the loss of nations, of strangers, and of each other. Practicing grief is the work of justice at the end of the world. So too are our 8 principles. At their core, they are founded upon the tragic vision. Our dedication to clearly articulated principles, not an ancient book, not a way of believing, not a creed. The principles are guiding lights that help us keep the course and embrace community. And these principles open us up to intersectional collaboration with many non-religious and religious groups, because we can't do this work alone. Preserving our fundamental democratic structures, holding up the fundamental work of humanity in our search for truth and meaning, dismantling white supremacy, and fighting the logic of genocide by recognizing our interconnection and our worth and dignity. These are the fundamental values of a humanity striving to turn divine injustice into human justice and compassion. Our principles not only hold in the face of the end of the world as we know it, they stand to hold the world up at the end of the world as we know it. Now, the reading today from the Tao Te Ching is the closest thing the Tao gets to describing a paradise. And Ursula K. Le Guin comments on this chapter that Lao Tzu seems to be saying, enjoy your life, live in your body. You are your body. Where else is there to go? Heaven and earth are one. As you walk the streets of your town, you walk on the way of heaven. Well, if we are not banking on that divine kingdom to solve our problems at the end of the world, if our town, our cities, our earth are the only place we can go, then let us see their divinity. Let us make their divinity. It is said that Martin Luther, the Protestant theologian, was planting an apple tree one day when one of his students asked him what he would be doing if this was the end of the world. Luther is said to have responded, even if it were the end of the world tomorrow, I would be planting my apple tree. All the science seems to agree that this is the end of the world as we know it. So may we see our streets as the way of heaven and our principles as our apple tree, worth planting in and of themselves. May it be so, and amen.